Hi, I'm Simon K. Jones, and this is the audio version of my Write More newsletter, where I talk about writing and publishing serial fiction. Today I'm having to think about writing from a limited subjective point of view, and choosing the point of view for your story is the big make or break decision. You have to figure out this ahead of time because it directly affects every aspect of the text. It's not really something you can decide upon while writing. Everything else can be tweaked and adjusted as you go, character arcs, plot beats, themes, but the point of view is the kind of translation layer between what's in your brain and what ends up on the page. Obviously, if you're just writing a novel in a normal way, not such a big deal. If you discover a third of the way in that you're not quite writing in the right structure for that particular story, you can rewrite it and change it. If you're publishing a serial as you go, which is how I like to do things, you kind of have to get it right from the start, otherwise you're going to get in a big old mess. So most of my serials have been written using a third-person narration with a limited and subjective point of view. Scenes are told from a single character's experience, with knowledge, sensory impact and attitudes tuned to the narrator character. In Tales from the Triverse, I often hop between characters within a single chapter. An earlier serial, The Mechanical Crown, was a bit stricter, with a single POV character per chapter. The stories I like to tell tend to be large in scope and feature ensemble casts, and a third-person limited POV lends itself to that structure. As a child, most of what I read was told from a more omniscient perspective. That's what I remember anyway. There was an additional kind of narrator character behind the scenes who existed off-screen and was recounting events. They knew everything and could provide insight into any character, and even directly address the reader. The first time I really noticed, I think, a limited third-person point of view being employed was in Kim Stanley Robinson's Mars trilogy. And now I think about it, this is probably the first time I really noticed point of view actively. The Mars trilogy is very strict in its structure. It goes really deep into a single character's perspective for extended chunks of the book. I'm sure I'd encountered this style of narrative in books previously, but Robinson's trilogy was the first time I'd properly actually noticed it. He hadn't written in this narrative form simply because it was what everyone else was doing, and he hadn't stumbled into it by accident. It was evidently a deliberate choice applied with precision to the story being told. Many years later, another Kim Stanley Robinson book again caught my attention for its clever use of point of view. Galileo's Dream might be my favourite of his works, and it's quite a departure from the Mars trilogy, and some spoilers incoming, so if you want to read it, go read that first. Galileo's Dream begins as a straight historical fiction, detailing Galileo's life, and would be an excellent book if that's all it was. It's told in a fairly standard third person for a big chunk of the first half. But there's a moment a fair way into the novel where there's an abrupt use of first person, and the previously invisible narrator becomes diegetic within the scene, shifting from a position of detached omniscience to being rooted within the story itself. It's a really startling moment which flips the story on its head, and it's done with a quiet subtlety that could be easily missed if a reader wasn't paying attention. The narrator then becomes an active player in the story itself. I love that this twist is done not through plot or dialogue, but by an unexpected shifting of the narrator's point of view. It's a kind of structural twist rather than anything else. The real joy of a subjective, limited point of view narrator is in the friction between what characters know and what the reader knows. That's often where I find the real joy in writing, constructing towers of tragic irony that come tumbling down at inopportune moments. I imagine my readers screaming as a character blunders their way through the story with limited information, unaware of what's really going on and what's about to hit them in the face. Examining my writing in the least romantic way possible, Tales from the Triverse has, at times, been an exercise in carefully timed information dumps. A more omniscient narrator, unless obviously specifically unreliable, makes the twists and turns of a conspiracy-laden story trickier to manage, because there's just too much knowledge going on in the story. For all of its sci-fi and fantasy trappings, most of Triverse is also wrapped in a crime fiction layer, which becomes especially effective when characters and readers are kept slightly in the dark. At the beginning of a story, the reader has very little information. Over time, with a multiple, limited third-person viewpoint structure, the reader will begin to form a more complex understanding of the situation, with each character/narrator a piece of a larger puzzle. By the time the reader reaches the climax, they will be picking up on subtle cues and hints about what is happening, how characters are motivated and what might happen next, all without any of it needing to be stated in the text. That's perhaps why I find it so compelling to write in this way. It's an efficient technique for show not tell. By juxtaposing the unique viewpoints of multiple characters, with all their idiosyncrasies, prejudices and assumptions, a story is built that resonates and feels more sophisticated than its individual components. Point of view is on my mind, I think, because I'm in the big finale stage of Tales from the Triverse. It's the part of the story where all the threads and characters from over 3 years of the serial have to coalesce in a way that makes sense, and which serves as a satisfying ending to all that's come before. As such, there's a lot of POV jumping going on, lots of hopping around locations and scenes. And so I have scenes from the point of view of Clark and Kaminsky, two of the detectives who have become lead characters. They're both caught up in events far bigger than themselves and are responding quite differently, while still working together towards a common goal. They're not heroic characters, which makes their heroism all the more compelling. But I'm also jumping into antagonists and finding out what is motivating them during such heightened times. Crucially, it's a chance to show their motivations and how they see themselves as the heroes. Each POV shift is a chance to undercut what's come before or reinforce it, and each time shining a light on events from a different angle. You tend to see a lot of talk of how different storytelling modes have moved in and out of popularity over time. The omniscient narrator being very popular in the classics but falling away in the 20th century, the rise of more subjective and limited perspectives. But really it's always about picking the right approach for the right story. I tend to write fiction that is easy to read, I think. I want readers to settle into my stories easily and be entertained. If there is challenge, I want it to be in the themes and the questions raised rather than in the prose itself. But Victoria Blay over on Notes made a really good point, which, when we were talking about second-person perspectives, she said, and quote, "I encountered a few essays written in second person during my literary non-fiction master's programme. They set me a bit off balance, perhaps in a good way. Writing/reading isn't always about comfort." End quote. Victoria's point is that challenge in the language itself can contribute to what a story is trying to achieve. The general consensus in that discussion over on Notes was that second person is easier to work with and read in shorter works, poetry, songs, short stories, even in games where it's very common, the writing is usually broken up by interactive elements where the player will be doing something other than reading. My first book and first published serial was A Day of Faces, told in the first-person POV of a teenage girl. I was far less experienced back then, and while Kay was a compelling character and I loved writing her voice, I quickly bumped into problems with the structure. The story I was trying to tell was larger than the tight first-person POV could convey. I ended up fudging it a bit with third-person interludes at key moments. It was a cheat that I've never been very happy about. That's why nailing the narrative framework of a novel is so critical, especially if you're writing and publishing a live serial. I didn't have a good handle on where A Day of Faces story was going, which is why I employed a structure that didn't entirely fit. In pre-production on Tales from the Triverse, I mapped out exactly what I wanted the story to be, which then dictated how the narrative would be formed. Anyway, that's me. How about you? Do you always write using the same approach to point of view, or do you change with each story? Head over to the newsletter and let me know down in the comments. I'll be taking a look. Okay, thanks for listening, and I'll see you on the next episode.